The wedding had over 300 guests, champagne towers, and a string quartet playing in the corner. Everything about it was designed to impress. Then Olivia Carter spotted a man walking through the entrance, and her expression shifted from radiant to something colder. She raised her hand and pointed directly at him, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Look who showed up, the charity case." The room turned. The laughter started slow, then spread. The man stood still, said nothing, and walked out in silence. Then, 40 minutes later, 3 black SUVs pulled up outside, and everything changed. Ryan Walker had not planned to arrive early. He pulled into the resort parking lot with enough time to straighten his tie in the rearview mirror and remind himself that this was just a wedding, a social obligation. Brandon Hayes had reached out 3 weeks prior, a short message friendly in tone, the kind that said, "We were close once, and I still think of you that way." Ryan had accepted without much deliberation. He and Brandon had been in the same circle at college, back when none of them had much, and the differences between them were mostly hypothetical. That was a long time ago. The Hargrove Estate Resort sat on the edge of a manicured hillside outside the city, the kind of venue that announced its price tag before you even reached the entrance gate. Stone archways, uniformed valets, a long driveway lined with white floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ryan noticed all of it without judgment. He had been to places like this before, though not always as a guest. There was a version of his life where spaces like this would have felt like a rebuke. That version was a long time ago, too. He walked through the entrance at just past 6 in the evening, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and followed the sound of the string quartet toward the main reception hall. The room was already filled close to 300 guests, arranged around circular tables, draped in ivory linen champagne flutes, catching the light from the chandeliers above. It was the kind of room designed to make everyone inside it feel they had arrived somewhere important. Ryan moved through the edge of the crowd, nodded at a few faces he half recognized, and looked for a seat near the back. He did not see Olivia until she saw him first. She was standing near the head table with a group of women in matching blush dresses when her eyes landed on him. He recognized her immediately, the posture, the particular way she held her chin slightly elevated, the expression that had always meant she was calculating something. They had dated for almost 2 years during college, the kind of relationship that felt enormous at the time, and then simply ended. She had broken it off the spring of their junior year, not long after she had started spending time with Brandon's social circle. Ryan had understood even then. He had not been angry. He had just moved forward. What he had not expected was the look on her face now. It was not surprise. It was not discomfort. It was something more deliberate than either of those things, and it took him a moment to name it contempt. Olivia lifted her hand and pointed at him from across the room. Her voice carried in the way voices do when someone wants to be heard. "Look who showed up," she said. "The charity case." Several heads turned. The women beside her exchanged glances. Someone laughed a single short sound that hung in the air like a signal. Then a few more followed. Ryan did not move. He stood at the edge of the room and let the moment land, the way you let cold air hit you when you step outside in winter. He did not flinch. He simply looked at her and waited to see what came next. What came next was Brandon. Brandon Hayes crossed the room with the relaxed confidence of a man on his own wedding day, in his own venue, surrounded by his own people. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had never spent a single day wondering whether he belonged somewhere. He clapped Ryan on the shoulder in a way that was almost friendly, and then turned back toward the crowd with a grin. "You know what they say about Ryan Walker," he announced, loud enough to address the nearest tables. He showed up to his first college party in a car that was held together by duct tape and optimism. The laughter spread a little wider this time. Ryan recognized the performance for what it was. This was not ribbing between old friends. This was a demonstration. Brandon was showing his guests, his 300 carefully selected guests, that he was the kind of man who could afford to be magnanimous towards someone like Ryan, that he could invite a man from a poorer background and then frame that invitation as a kind of charity. The joke was not about the car. The joke was about Ryan's place in the room, and everyone in the room was being asked to agree with it. Olivia drifted closer now, fully in her element. She spoke to the table beside her, more than she spoke to Ryan directly the way people do when they want an audience, without the appearance of wanting one. She mentioned the apartment Ryan had lived in during sophomore year, a studio above a laundromat, which she described as barely above camping. She mentioned the second-hand suit he had worn to their first formal event together. Each detail was delivered with a smile framed as nostalgia, but pointed at Ryan like something sharp. The table laughed. The adjacent table leaned in. Ryan watched the guests. He watched them the way you watch a room you are trying to understand. Some were genuinely entertained. Some laughed because laughing was easier than not. Some looked briefly uncomfortable, and then looked away, settling into their chairs with a kind of studied neutrality that said, "This has nothing to do with me." A woman at the third table from the front caught his eye for half a second before redirecting her attention to her champagne glass. A man near the window adjusted his cufflinks. Not one person said anything. Not one guest pushed back, changed the subject, or offered Ryan so much as a neutral glance. The silence of the uninvolved was not passive. It was a decision made quietly by each person in the room, one at a time. He did not feel rage. He had expected something closer to rage, but what he actually felt was quieter and colder than that. It was recognition. He had grown up in a neighborhood where men were dismissed before they opened their mouths, where the brand on your shoes or the zip code on your license could tell a room everything it decided to know about you. He had spent years working past that, not by forgetting it, but by understanding exactly how it operated. What was happening in this room was the same mechanism dressed in nicer clothes. Brandon's group of friends had migrated closer. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in a three-piece suit, who Ryan did not recognize, made a comment about the parking lot. Something about how it must have been Ryan's first time using valet service. The group laughed. Brandon laughed. Olivia smiled with the satisfaction of a woman watching something go exactly as she intended. Another man in the group said something about the open bar, implying Ryan had come for the free drinks. The joke was lazy and mean in equal measure, and the table received it warmly. Ryan had two options in front of him, and he knew it. The first was to respond, to correct the record, to defend himself, to say the things that were technically true and socially devastating. He had the material. He had more material than any of these people were prepared for. The second option was to hold, to say nothing that could be used against him, to leave the door closed a little longer. He chose the second option, not because he was passive, not because he was afraid. He chose it because it was the right play, and because he had learned a long time ago that the most important decisions a man makes are the ones he makes when someone is watching and waiting for him to lose control. He kept his expression neutral, made brief eye contact with Brandon, and said simply, "Congratulations on the wedding." Then he took a step toward the nearest empty chair. Brandon's expression shifted. There was something in Ryan's composure that did not fit the script, a flatness, a lack of reaction that made the joke feel incomplete. The laughter in the immediate area quieted slightly. Olivia's smile stayed in place, but tightened at the corners. It was Derek Carter who moved next. Olivia's older brother had been stationed near the edge of the group with the posture of a man who had appointed himself to handle problems. He stepped in front of Ryan not aggressively, but deliberately, the way a door swings shut. He was taller than Ryan Broader and looked at him with the calm authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I think you've had your moment," Derek said. "Time to call it a night." Ryan looked at him. He said nothing. Derek took that as an invitation to continue. He said that this was a private event, that Ryan's presence was making people uncomfortable, and that the right thing, the respectful thing, would be for Ryan to leave before the evening went any further. He kept his voice low, which was its own kind of threat, the kind that said, I am being reasonable. Which means if this escalates, it will be your fault. He added that nobody wanted a scene, said it with the particular confidence of a man who believed he was offering a courtesy rather than delivering an ultimatum. 2 members of the security staff had materialized on either side of Ryan, by then not touching him, but positioned with the specific stillness of men who had been asked to handle something. The message was physical, even without contact. A handful of nearby guests had stopped pretending to have other conversations. They were watching openly now, the way people watch something they are glad is not happening to them. Olivia, standing a few feet back, delivered her final line of the scene with the brightness of someone who had already decided how the story ended. "It was sweet of Brandon to invite you," she said, "but I think everyone can see this isn't really your world." Ryan looked at her for a moment. The words sat between them. He did not answer. He straightened his jacket, turned toward the exit without being escorted, and walked through the main doors and into the open air of the resort grounds. Behind him, the room let out a collective exhale, and then the conversation resumed louder than before, the way it always does after something uncomfortable has been witnessed and survived and filed away. Ryan walked to a quiet area near the edge of the parking lot, away from the valets and the arriving guests. The evening air was cooler out here. He could still hear the faint sound of the quartet through the glass walls of the reception hall. He stood still for a moment, not in defeat, not in anger, but in the particular stillness of a man taking stock of exactly what has just happened, and exactly what comes next. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He made one call. It lasted under 2 minutes. He said very little, and what he said was specific. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, looked out toward the main gate of the resort, and waited. He had not planned to arrive early. He had also not planned to leave quietly. But he had always known from the moment he accepted Brandon's invitation that the evening would not end the way most people in that room expected it to. The parking lot was quiet in the way that expensive places are quiet at night, not empty, but controlled. A valet stood near the entrance booth, pretending not to have noticed what had just happened inside. A few guests were still arriving, handing over their keys without looking up from their phones. Ryan stood near the far edge of the lot past the row of luxury vehicles, where the manicured lawn gave way to a low stone wall and a view of the hillside below. The lights of the city were visible at a distance, steady and indifferent. He had his phone in his hand and had already made the call. Now he simply waited. Inside the reception hall, he knew the evening had already resumed its shape. The quartet would be playing. The champagne would be circulating. Someone would make a toast about Brandon and Olivia's love story, and the room would raise their glasses, and the moment that had just occurred, the pointing, the laughter. The escort to the door would be absorbed into the background noise of a very expensive party. That was how these things worked. The discomfort passed through the room like a ripple, and then the surface went smooth again. No one would mention it at dinner. No one would ask whether it was right. They would simply continue, because continuing was always easier than stopping and asking yourself what you had just been part of. Ryan understood that. He had understood it from the moment he walked out the front doors. What had happened inside was not an accident or an impulse. It was a performance, and it had worked exactly as Olivia intended it to work. She had wanted the room to see Ryan in a particular way, and the room had obliged. Every person who laughed and every person who stayed silent had made the same choice, just in different registers. Neither required courage, neither cost anything at all, at least not tonight, and not in any way that any of them would feel before morning. He looked down at the screen of his phone. The call had taken less than 2 minutes. His chief of staff, a precise and unflappable woman named Margaret Holt, had not asked him why he was calling from a wedding venue on a Saturday evening. She had asked only what he needed and had said it would be handled. Margaret had been with him for 6 years, long enough to know that when Ryan called with a specific set of instructions in a flat tone of voice, there was a reason, and the reason would become clear in due course. What he had asked for was simple: his senior team. Not all of them, but the ones that mattered for what came next. His lead counsel, a man named Patrick Greer, who had spent 20 years in corporate law and had the particular quality of being frightening when he smiled. His head of investments, a woman named Sandra Cole, who had overseen 3 of the fund's largest acquisitions and who wore her authority the way other people wore expensive watches, visibly without drawing attention to it, and 2 of his senior analysts who had been working the Hayes Property Group account for the past several months, the account that had brought Ryan to this city in the first place, and had incidentally been the reason Brandon Hayes had reached out with that friendly, casual message 3 weeks ago. The Hayes Property Group. Ryan had known about the connection when he accepted the invitation. He had told himself it was not the reason he came, and that was true, mostly. He had come because he and Brandon had been friends once, in the uncomplicated way young men are friends before money and ambition draw clean lines between them. He had come with the honest intention of sharing a meal and wishing them well and leaving before the dancing started. He had not come expecting this, but he had also not come unprepared. The fund he had built over the past 9 years managed assets worth several $100 million. It operated quietly by design. Ryan had never been interested in the kind of visibility that required a publicist or a profile in a business magazine. The work mattered. The results mattered. The name on the door did not. That was a philosophy that served him well in most contexts, and had apparently served him poorly in this one, because not a single person inside that reception hall had any idea who he was when he walked through the door. They had looked at his jacket and made a decision. They had looked at the way he moved through the room without the easy ownership that came with generational wealth, and made another decision. They had taken the sum of those decisions and arrived at a conclusion before he had said a single word. That was about to change. The first black SUV appeared at the resort's main gate a little under 40 minutes after Ryan had walked out of the reception hall. It moved at a steady, unhurried speed up the driveway, and a second followed 30 seconds behind it, and then a third. The vehicles were dark and unmarked, and moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that drew attention precisely because it was so deliberate. The valet near the entrance straightened. A couple walking toward the front doors slowed their pace and looked back over their shoulders. One of the security staff who had escorted Ryan out earlier was standing near the entrance and watched the vehicles approach with an expression that had shifted from routine alertness into something less certain. Ryan walked toward the gate as his team stepped out of the vehicles. Margaret was in the first car tablet already in hand, her expression the same composed neutrality she wore in boardrooms and during depositions, and apparently at resort venues on Saturday nights. Patrick Greer stepped out of the second car, adjusting his jacket a leather document case under one arm. Sandra Cole came out behind him, and the 2 analysts followed, all of them dressed as though they had come from the office rather than their homes on a weekend, which told Ryan that Margaret had called them before he had even finished his own sentence. He gave them a brief summary standing near the stone wall at the edge of the driveway. He kept it factual. He said where they were, who was inside, and what had taken place. He told them the purpose of the visit was not personal, it was professional, and it would be conducted professionally. Patrick nodded once. Sandra was already looking at something on her phone. The analysts exchanged a glance that they were careful not to let Ryan see. Inside the reception hall, the scene had settled in a way that suggested no one expected the evening to produce any further surprises. Derek Carter had returned to his position near the edge of the room, satisfied that the matter had been resolved. Olivia was laughing at the head table, her hand resting on Brandon's arm, both of them luminous with the particular glow of people who believe the difficult part of the evening is behind them. Brandon had made a small speech about old friends and new beginnings that the room had received warmly, and the band had transitioned from classical to something slightly more celebratory, and the waitstaff had begun clearing the first course. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Then one of the security staff appeared at Brandon's shoulder and leaned down to speak quietly into his ear. Brandon's expression did not change immediately. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are buying time to process something. Then he looked toward the main entrance of the hall, and his expression changed in a way that was difficult to describe. Not quite recognition, not quite alarm, but something in between, like a man watching a familiar shape appear in an unfamiliar context and not yet knowing what it means. Ryan walked through the entrance of the reception hall for the second time that evening. He walked in the same way he had the first time, without rushing, without performance, with the same settled composure that had unnerved Brandon earlier. Behind him, Margaret walked slightly to his left, tablet in hand. Patrick Greer walked to his right. Sandra Cole and the analysts followed in a loose formation that was not quite military, but carried its own particular weight. They moved through the room the way credibility moves through a room quietly, and then all at once. The music did not stop. But the conversations nearest to the entrance did, and the silence spread in a slow ring outward from the door, table by table, the way it does when a room collectively understands that something significant has entered it, without yet knowing what that something is. Derek Carter moved first. He crossed the room with the same authority he had used earlier, though it was already sitting differently on him, a little less settled, a little more effortful. He positioned himself between Ryan and the main floor of the room and said that Ryan had been asked to leave. He said that if Ryan chose to remain on the premises, the resort staff would involve local authorities. His voice was level and his posture was wide, the stance of a man who was no longer entirely sure his position would hold, but was committed to maintaining the appearance that it would. Ryan looked at him with the same even attention he had given him the first time. Then he said calmly that he was there for a conversation with Brandon Hayes, and that the nature of that conversation was professional. He said that he was not there to disrupt the evening, and that everything that needed to happen could happen in a matter of minutes. He said it the way a man says something that is simply true, without the need for emphasis. Derek held his ground for a moment longer, searching Ryan's face for something he could use: anger, aggression, anything that would justify escalation. He did not find it. Patrick Greer opened the document case and produced a single folder, which he held without opening. That folder, unopened, communicated more than its contents could have in that moment. Olivia had turned in her chair at the head table. The brightness she had carried all evening was still on her face, but it had stiffened slightly, the way a smile stiffens when it is no longer fully voluntary. She looked at Ryan, then at the people behind him, then back at Ryan. Something was registering, not the full picture yet, but enough of it to introduce a question she had not been carrying 5 minutes ago. Brandon stood up from the head table. To his credit, he did not look panicked. He looked like a man in an expensive suit at his own wedding reception, who was choosing very carefully, in real time, how to respond to something he had not anticipated. He crossed the room toward Ryan with a measured pace, and when he reached him, he lowered his voice to the register of a private conversation. "Ryan," he said, "whatever this is tonight is not the night." Ryan's answer was brief. He said that the timing was not his choice. He said that his team had been scheduled to present a preliminary decision regarding the Hayes Property Group account later in the following week, and that the events of the evening had made it appropriate to move that conversation forward. He said it without heat. He said it the way a man closes a door, not with force, but with finality. Brandon's jaw tightened. He looked at Patrick, then at Sandra, then at Margaret, who was watching him with the precise attentiveness of someone who had sat across from men like him in 100 rooms and had never once found them surprising. Brandon looked back at Ryan. The calculation behind his eyes was visible now, not hidden by confidence anymore, but running openly, urgently the way it runs when the numbers are not adding up. The room had gone almost fully quiet. The band was still playing, but softly now, as though even the musicians had understood that the room's attention had shifted somewhere else entirely. Guests were standing. Some had set down their glasses. Some were whispering behind their hands, looking from Ryan to Brandon and back again, trying to assemble the picture from the pieces they had. Derek Carter stood near the side wall, and for the first time that evening, he was not moving toward anything. He was watching the way everyone else in the room was watching, with the specific stillness of a man who has just realized that the situation he thought he had managed had not in fact been managed at all. Olivia rose from her chair and moved toward the center of the room. She wore the expression of a woman who had decided that the best way to manage this situation was to control the narrative before it controlled her. She said Ryan's name. She said it with a lightness that was visibly constructed. She said something about old friends and long evenings, and the fact that everyone had had a little too much to drink, herself included. She attempted a laugh. The laugh did not land. Ryan turned to look at her. He did not answer what she had said. He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his expression was not anger and not satisfaction. It was something closer to clarity, the look of a man who is seeing something exactly as it is, without the benefit of any illusion, and is entirely at peace with what he sees. Then he turned back to Brandon and said simply that they should find somewhere to sit down. They used a side room off the main corridor, a small event anteroom with a rectangular table, 6 chairs, and the kind of neutral decor that suggested it had been designed for exactly this kind of conversation. Private, contained, without the weight of the main hall pressing in from all sides. A resort manager had opened the door without being asked twice, which told Ryan that whoever had briefed the staff had done so efficiently. Margaret had a way of making rooms available. Brandon sat across from Ryan with Patrick Greer to Ryan's right and Sandra Cole to his left. The 2 analysts remained near the door. Brandon had come alone. No Derek, no Olivia, no group of friends to absorb the atmosphere. That was either a choice or a concession, and the distinction no longer mattered much. Outside, through the closed door, the faint sound of the reception carried on. The band, the murmur of people who were no longer fully dancing, who were gathered in clusters near their tables, speaking in lowered voices about what they had just witnessed and what it might mean. Ryan set both hands flat on the table and looked at Brandon directly. He said that he was not there to discuss the evening in personal terms. He said that anything Brandon wanted to say about what had happened in the main hall could be said later, in whatever form Brandon chose. That was not why they were sitting in this room. They were sitting in this room because the Hayes Property Group had spent the last 4 months in preliminary discussions with Ryan's fund regarding a capital investment that would represent one of the largest single infusions of outside funding in the company's history. That conversation had been moving forward on a professional basis. What happened tonight had introduced a variable that needed to be addressed before that conversation could continue. Brandon opened his mouth and then closed it. The thing about Brandon Hayes Ryan had always known was that he was intelligent. He had grown up in money, but he had not grown lazy in it. He understood deal structures. He understood leverage, and he understood sitting in this room exactly what was being said to him without being said directly. Ryan's fund had the capital. The Hayes Property Group needed that capital, and the man holding the capital had just been publicly humiliated by the groom and bride at their own wedding in front of 300 witnesses, several of whom would have the story circulating before the night was over. Patrick Greer set the folder on the table but did not open it. He said in the measured tone of a man who chose his words, the way surgeons choose instruments, that the fund's investment committee maintained a standard conduct and reputational review process that applied to all principals and key stakeholders in any prospective deal. He said that the events of the evening had created a circumstance that would require that process to be formally initiated. He said it without judgment. He said it as information. Brandon looked from Patrick to Ryan. He said that the evening had gotten out of hand. He said that Olivia had, and then he stopped because there was no version of that sentence that ended well, and he was smart enough to know it. He said that he could make this right. He said it with the particular urgency of a man who had spent his entire adult life in situations where things could be made right with the right gesture at the right time, and who was only now beginning to understand that this was not one of those situations. Ryan let the silence hold for a moment. Then he said something that Brandon had not expected. He said that this was not about Brandon making anything right. He said that what happened tonight was not primarily a problem between the two of them. He said it was a problem that involved every person in that room, the ones who laughed and the ones who chose not to say anything when they could have. He said that the investment review would proceed the way it was designed to proceed, and that its outcome would be determined by facts and process, not by anything said in this room tonight. Then he stood up. Brandon's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession relief at what seemed like a reprieve, then confusion at its terms, then something that looked very much like genuine discomfort. He was not accustomed to situations where the person holding leverage chose not to use it as a weapon. He had expected a demand. He had prepared in the 30 seconds he'd had to prepare for a negotiation, a number, a condition, something he could agree to and move past. What Ryan had given him instead was something harder to respond to, a refusal to make it personal, delivered by a man who had every reason to make it personal, and had chosen with full awareness not to. Ryan walked out of the anteroom and back into the main corridor. His team followed without a word. When he reached the entrance to the reception hall, he did not walk past it. He turned, pushed the doors open, and walked back into the room. The effect was immediate. The guests who had been standing near their tables, speaking in low voices about what they had witnessed, turned toward the entrance simultaneously. The band came to a stop. The room went to something close to full silence, not the polite quiet of an attentive audience, but the held breath silence of a room that does not know what it is about to receive, and understands instinctively that it matters. Ryan walked to the center of the floor. He did not raise his voice. The room was quiet enough that he did not need to. He looked out across the tables at the guests, who had laughed at the ones who had looked away at the ones who had studied their plates with the careful attention of people who did not want to be remembered as having been present. He said that he was not going to talk about himself. He said that most of the people in the room did not know him, and that was fine, and that what he was about to say had nothing to do with who he was or what he had built. He said that none of that was the point. Then he asked the room a question. He asked how many of them had seen what happened earlier in the evening. Most of the room stayed still. A few people shifted in their seats. He asked not rhetorically, but directly, whether any of them had considered saying something. Whether any of them watching a man be pointed at and mocked in the middle of a room full of people had felt that it was wrong and had chosen for whatever reason to remain silent. He let the question sit in the room without answering it himself. He gave it space the way you give a room space when you want people to actually hear what was just said, rather than simply wait for the next sentence. A woman near the left side of the room, middle-aged, in a dark green dress, looked down at her hands. The man beside her looked at the tablecloth. Across the room, two women who had been among the first to laugh were now looking at the floor with the rigid stillness of people trying to become invisible. The room did not answer. It did not need to. Ryan said that silence in the face of something wrong was not neutrality. He said that rooms like this one, full of educated people, people with resources and social standing, and the ability to shape how a moment lands, were precisely the rooms where silence was most expensive, because the people in them had the least excuse for it, and the most capacity to change it. He said it without anger, and that absence of anger was more unsettling than anger would have been. He said it the way a man states something he has thought about for a long time and has finally found the right occasion to say aloud. Olivia was standing near the head table. She had not moved since Ryan re-entered the room. The brightness she had worn all evening was gone, not dimmed, but absent, the way a light goes out rather than fades. She was watching Ryan with an expression that contained too many things at once to read cleanly, embarrassment, defensiveness, and underneath both of those, something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. She knew what she had done. She had known while she was doing it. What she had not anticipated was that anyone would ever make her stand still in a room full of witnesses and feel the full, undiminished weight of it. Derek Carter was near the side wall, his earlier authority entirely absent. He was watching Ryan the way everyone else was watching Ryan, without interference, without the posture of a man prepared to act. Whatever role he had assigned himself at the start of the evening, he was not playing it now. He was simply present in a room where something was happening that he had not caused and could not stop, and the awareness of that sat visibly on him. Brandon had followed Ryan back into the hall and stood near the corridor entrance. He was not looking at Ryan. He was looking at his guests, at the room full of people who had come to celebrate him and were now watching something that reordered the evening's meaning entirely. Brandon had curated this event with precision. He had chosen this venue, these guests, this version of himself. The version currently standing at the edge of the room, watching his wedding reception become a quiet reckoning, was not the one he had designed. Ryan looked at both of them not with contempt, not with the satisfaction of a man who has won something, but with the level attention of someone who wants to be clearly understood. He said that the business decisions ahead would be handled the way business decisions were always handled, through process, through review, through standards that existed independent of personal feelings. He said that whatever those processes produced, they would produce on their own terms. He was not there to punish anyone. He was not there to collect an apology. He was there because 300 people had witnessed something that evening, and at least some of them deserved the opportunity to understand what they had been part of. Then he thanked the room for its attention. He said it plainly, without irony, and turned toward the exit. Margaret was already near the door. Patrick Greer and Sandra Cole fell into step behind Ryan without a word. The analysts followed. The sound of footsteps across the polished floor was the only sound in the room for several seconds, and then the murmur began, low at first, spreading across the tables, the way it does when a room is processing something it did not expect to be asked to carry home. At the door, Ryan did not look back. There was nothing left to see that he had not already seen. He had not come to this resort to prove anything about himself. He had not come back to that hall to win a room. He had come back because 300 people had made a series of choices inside that hall, and at least some of them deserved to stand in the presence of those choices for long enough to feel their weight. He walked through the main entrance and out into the evening air. The 3 black SUVs were idling near the gate. The valet who had watched him leave earlier watched him now with an expression that had shifted from confusion into something quieter. The night air was cooler than it had been when Ryan arrived, and he stood still for a moment near the edge of the driveway, looking at nothing in particular. Inside, the reception was resuming slowly, unevenly, the way a room restarts after something has moved through it and changed its shape. The band picked up a chord. A voice said something into a microphone. The evening would continue. Weddings always continued. The flowers were still white. The champagne was still cold. Brandon and Olivia would finish the night as husband and wife, and the morning would come, and by the time Sunday arrived, the shape of what had happened would be visible to people who had not even been in the room. Ryan got into the first SUV. Margaret was already on a call. Patrick had the folder open, reading quietly. The vehicle pulled away from the resort and down the long driveway, and Ryan watched the entrance gate disappear behind the curve of the road. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated in the way people imagine vindication feels: loud, immediate, satisfying. What he felt was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the steadiness of a man who had been asked in the most public way possible to be ashamed of where he came from, and who had found with complete certainty that he was not, that he had never been, and that no room, no matter how expensive, no matter how many people it held, had ever had the authority to tell him otherwise. The fund's review process would take several weeks. Whatever it produced, it would produce honestly. Ryan had meant that. He had no interest in decisions made from spite or the desire to settle a score. The world was full of rooms that decided who belonged before anyone had the chance to speak. Rooms that read the label before opening the bottle and called that judgment. Ryan had spent his entire adult life understanding how those rooms worked. What tonight had confirmed, more clearly than anything else could have, was that the only thing those rooms could never account for was a man who already knew his own value and had absolutely no need for theirs. The road opened ahead. The city lights spread across the distance. Margaret finished her call and made a note on her tablet, and the 3 black SUVs moved through the dark in a steady, unhurried line. And Ryan Walker looked out the window and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left that needed to be said.